I used to think I was just unlucky, that maybe I had some kind of hidden curse or bad karma, because every time certain people visited me, even if it was just for a few hours, something in my life would suddenly spiral. My car would break down out of nowhere. My bank account would take a hit for some mysterious reason. Arguments with my partner would erupt over nothing, and I'd sit there afterward, head in my hands, thinking, what the hell just happened? At first, I dismissed it. Coincidences, right? Life is unpredictable, but the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. I began noticing patterns. It wasn't everyone, just certain people, and not always in dramatic ways, but enough to leave a mark, a kind of residue. After they left, it was like the air in my house grew heavier. I'd feel exhausted, drained, and slowly I started realizing something that honestly scared me. It wasn't about the event itself. It was about what these people carried with them, what they brought into my space. You know that quote by Jung? We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. I think he meant that literally. These people weren't just visiting my house. They were holding up a mirror to some part of me I wasn't ready to face. And every time I let them in, it was like opening the door to a darker version of myself. Not because they were evil or malicious, but because they carried energy that resonated with something unhealed in me. Their presence amplified what I hadn't yet dealt with. There was one moment that really shifted everything for me. My cousin, someone I hadn't seen in over a year, stopped by just to catch up. We talked, laughed, shared stories. It seemed innocent. But later that evening, I had one of the worst fights with my wife that we'd ever had, over something trivial. And it escalated so quickly, it felt like a bomb had gone off in our living room. For the first time, she actually packed a bag and left. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the wall, thinking, how did we go from peaceful to broken in just a few hours? I retraced my steps and couldn't shake the feeling that something shifted the moment my cousin left. Not because he said or did anything obviously harmful, but because the energy he carried, his bitterness about his life, his subtle jealousy, his masked resentment, it stayed in the room long after he walked out, and somehow it seeped into us. That was the first time I really started to take responsibility for the space I allowed others to occupy, both physically and emotionally. You know how we're always taught to be kind, to be welcoming, especially to family, that it's rude to turn someone away? I believed that. For years, I told myself that being a good person meant being available, but I've learned that being available to everyone comes at a cost, and sometimes the price is your peace. There's something sacred about our personal space. It's more than just walls and furniture. It holds our energy, our stories, our healing, and when someone enters that space carrying unresolved chaos, even if they don't say a word, they bring that storm with them. You can feel it in the silence, in the way your body tenses up, in how, afterward, your thoughts start spiraling into places you thought you had left behind. I don't think it's about superstition or mystical curses. I think it's about energy, the subtle but powerful exchanges we experience every day. And more importantly, I think it's about awareness. Once you start noticing how you feel around certain people and how your life shifts after they're gone, it's hard to unsee it. That's when the real work begins, because then comes the guilt, the inner voice that says, but he's family, but she needed someone. But I don't want to be selfish. I wrestled with that guilt for a long time, but I've come to understand this. Protecting your peace is not selfish. It's sacred, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for others is to say, not today. It took me years to learn that no can be a full sentence, that I don't owe anyone access to my home, my time, or my heart if it costs me my well-being. And trust me, I didn't get there easily. It was trial and error, pain and clarity. But now, when someone leaves my space and I feel lighter instead of heavier, I know I made the right choice. We often talk about decluttering our homes, but we forget that the most important thing to clear out isn't the stuff, it's the energy. And sometimes that means saying goodbye to people who don't even realize the weight they carry or the damage they leave behind. So, yeah, I used to think I was cursed. Now I understand I just wasn't protecting my sanctuary. And the moment I started doing that, everything changed. There's something particularly disarming about people who seem to be in a constant state of misfortune. You know the type, the ones who never really ask how you're doing, because they're too busy cataloging all the ways life has wronged them. It starts off innocent enough. Maybe they're just having a bad day. Maybe they need to vent. We all do sometimes, right? But then they come again, and again. And every single time, it's like opening a floodgate of sorrow. They don't visit you, they offload on you. Their stories don't change. Their tone doesn't lift. And the air gets a little heavier with every word they speak. You try to help. You listen, offer advice, suggest solutions. But none of it sticks. Because deep down, they don't want solutions. They want your sympathy. Or more precisely, they want your energy. I had a relative like that. My aunt. Every time she came over, it was a 3-hour monologue of everything that was wrong with the world. Her job, her health, her neighbors, the government, the food prices, her youth slipping away. At first, I thought I was being a good nephew, lending an ear, offering support. But over time, I noticed something strange. After every visit, I felt completely wiped out, like someone had wrung out my soul and left me hollow. Even more unsettling, things would start going wrong in my life right after she left. My sleep would be disturbed. I'd start snapping at my wife over nonsense. Financial surprises would hit. Unexpected bills, car trouble, minor accidents. It was like a ripple effect. And I started to wonder, was I just more sensitive to life's stressors after being emotionally drained, or was something deeper happening? That's when I stumbled upon something Jung wrote about how people project their unresolved darkness onto others, and how, if we're not conscious of it, we absorb it as our own. He called it the shadow. And suddenly, it all made sense. These victims, these chronic complainers, they weren't just talking, they were bleeding. And every time I opened the door, I wasn't just offering them tea and company, I was offering them a vein. It's a difficult realization to accept, especially when you care, especially when you were raised to believe that helping people is what makes you good. But there's a fine line between compassion and codependency, and I had crossed it more times than I could count. The truth is, people who live in a victim mindset don't want to climb out of the pit. They want you to climb into it with them. They don't seek connection, they seek co-suffering. They want their despair to be shared because it validates them. Misery loves company, and not just for companionship, but for survival, because if someone else drowns with them, then maybe they're not drowning at all. It's such a subtle manipulation that you don't even realize it's happening. One day, you're offering a kind word. A week later, you're rearranging your schedule around their drama. A month later, you're wondering why you feel so sad, so uninspired, so empty, and can't quite put your finger on it. I remember one night, after another long visit from my aunt, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at my coffee cup. I felt this overwhelming sadness that wasn't even mine. It was hers, but it had attached to me like fog on skin. That's when I knew, this isn't empathy, this is emotional contamination. So I started pulling back, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I still loved her, I still wished her well, but I couldn't let her use my soul as a dumping ground anymore. I set limits, subtle at first, then clearer over time. I stopped inviting her over. I stopped picking up the phone every time. I learned to say, I'm not in the space for that right now, and meant it. It wasn't easy. The guilt was loud, but my peace was louder. And as I distanced myself, something beautiful began to happen. I had more energy, more clarity, fewer random mishaps. My home felt lighter, calmer. My relationships deepened. I was no longer constantly on edge, waiting for the next crisis that wasn't even mine. Jung once said that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. These visitors, these victims, they were messengers, not just of their pain, but of my boundaries, or rather, the lack of them. Now, I don't ignore these types of people. I see them, I understand them, but I don't carry them, not anymore. Because I've realized something vital. Helping someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. And being kind doesn't mean being available to everyone. Some doors, no matter how heavy with history or guilt, need to stay closed. Not because you're heartless, but because you finally understand the value of your own heart. Have you ever had someone walk into your home and, without even realizing it, strip away your sense of safety, of confidence, of being okay with who you are? They don't shout. They don't insult you outright. They just notice things, point out details, make passing comments that feel like tiny paper cuts. Oh, you haven't painted this wall yet? Still renting? Thought you'd have your own place by now. You look tired. Everything all right? Always followed by that smile, the kind that hides judgment behind concern. At first, I brushed it off. I thought I was being too sensitive, that maybe I was just insecure and overreacting. But then I started seeing a pattern. The same few people who offered these helpful observations were always the ones who left me second-guessing my choices. They never offered real support, just a steady stream of shoulds and not enoughs. And after every visit, I would spiral, start rearranging furniture, looking up new jobs, overthinking conversations with my wife. It was like I had suddenly become ashamed of my own life. One of the worst offenders was, again, my aunt. She would walk into my home like a critic reviewing a play, commenting on everything from the color of the curtains to the fact that we still didn't have a dishwasher. She'd ask how work was going, then casually mention how my cousin's son just got promoted. Or she'd tilt her head and ask, "Still no kids?" All of it under the guise of love, of care. But it was never about connection. It was about comparison, about control, about pushing me into some mold she thought I should have fit into by now. That's when I started digging deeper, not just into her patterns, but into my own reaction. Why did her words have so much power over me? Why did I feel so small in her presence? And then I remembered something I'd read in Jung's work, that the people who trigger us most often reflect back the parts of ourselves we haven't made peace with. My aunt's criticisms hit a nerve not because they were true, but because they echoed the quiet doubts I hadn't yet confronted in myself. The collective unconscious, Jung's idea that society programs us with inherited ideas of success, beauty, and worth, was alive and well in my living room, and people like my aunt were just vessels for that programming. They weren't necessarily malicious. They were repeating what had been repeated to them, but that didn't make the impact any less real. So I started experimenting with something I now call the mirror pause. Whenever someone said something that stung, instead of reacting or retreating, I'd ask, is this really about me, or is this their script playing out? 9 times out of 10, I realized they weren't thinking deeply at all. They were just parroting beliefs they'd never questioned, and I didn't need to accept any of it. One time my aunt told me, "In your age, your father already had a house and 2 kids. You're falling behind." I smiled and calmly replied, "That's an interesting point. Why do you think that timeline matters so much?" She blinked, stammered, changed the subject. And for the first time, I saw it. She wasn't the authority she pretended to be. She was just someone clinging to an old map in a world that had already changed. Another strategy that saved me? The phrase, "Thank you, but I'm comfortable with how I live." It's polite, it's firm, it leaves no room for argument. And every time I used it, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. I realized I didn't have to defend my life like it was on trial. My home isn't a courtroom, and these visitors aren't judges, unless I let them be. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with no longer needing approval. It's quiet but powerful. You start decorating your home for you, not for how it'll look in someone's eyes. You stop explaining your choices and start enjoying them. And most importantly, you begin to realize that people who truly love you don't want to reshape you. They just want to sit with you as you are. Of course, setting those boundaries wasn't always smooth. Some people pulled away, others got offended. A few stopped visiting altogether. But in their absence, something else filled the room. Peace. And that's when I knew I wasn't losing relationships. I was clearing space for healthier ones. Jung once said, "The greatest injustice we do to ourselves is to deny our own truth in favor of someone else's expectations." I carried that line with me like a shield. Every time I felt the urge to justify, to apologize, to explain my life, I'd whisper it in my head, and suddenly I'd remember, I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to be someone, authentically, fully, freely. So if you ever find yourself doubting your worth after someone leaves your home, ask yourself, were they offering love or were they selling judgment? And did you buy it? Because your life, in all its imperfect beauty, doesn't need validation. It just needs room to breathe. There's a sacred kind of intimacy in the space we call home. It holds more than our furniture and keepsakes. It holds our moods, our memories, our routines, our most unguarded selves. It's where we cry without hiding, laugh without shame, rest without apology. And yet, so many of us allow people in who treat that space like a train station. Loud, intrusive, unaware. I had a friend once, someone I grew up with. We were close, the kind of close where favors didn't need asking. So when he asked if he could crash at my place for a few nights after a breakup, I didn't hesitate. Of course, I said yes. I even made up the guest bed, stocked the fridge, and told him to make himself at home. And he did. He really did. Within a week, his new girlfriend showed up unannounced. She moved in like it was the most natural thing. Then came their dog, shedding on the couch, barking through the night. Then his friends, game nights, drinking, loud music, dirty dishes that weren't mine. It was like my apartment had turned into a hostel, and I was the invisible concierge. I tried to be patient. I told myself, he's going through a rough time. He needs support. But inside, I was unraveling. I'd wake up dreading my own mornings. I'd leave work and sit in the car outside my building just to delay going back in. My sanctuary, my space for reflection, creativity, healing, had been colonized. And the worst part, he didn't even notice. When I finally gathered the courage to say something, to gently suggest it might be time to make other arrangements, he looked genuinely hurt. "I thought we were friends," he said. "You can't even let me stay a little longer." That line hit me like a punch in the chest. The guilt was instant, but then something inside me, something small but firm, pushed back. What kind of friendship demands silence in exchange for loyalty? What kind of love needs you to suffer quietly just to prove you care? Jung had a term for this kind of boundary erosion. He called it the dissolution of the self, the quiet betrayal of your own needs in the name of belonging. And that's what I had done. I had let someone else's comfort swallow my own. I had made my home, my emotional haven, into a dumping ground for someone else's unresolved life. After he left, and he did eventually leave, the silence was deafening, but it wasn't empty. It was healing. It was a return. I stood in the middle of my living room and breathed. For the first time in weeks, I could hear my own thoughts again. The space felt mine, not because I owned it, but because I had claimed it. From that experience, I learned something essential. Just because someone is close to you doesn't mean they're entitled to you. Friendship, family, love, they should never be a ticket into your inner world unless they come with respect. And respect means asking, noticing, reciprocating. It means recognizing that your home is not just a place. It's a reflection of your soul. You see, some people treat your space like it's an extension of the outside world, a place to crash, to eat, to lounge. But the truth is, your home is a mirror of your boundaries. If someone walks in and ignores those boundaries, they're not just being rude. They're telling you how much or how little they value your inner life. I started paying attention after that. To who asked permission before opening the fridge? To who wiped their shoes before stepping inside? To who offered help, brought small gifts, asked how they could contribute? Those little acts, they mean so much more than people think. They say, I see you. I respect this space. I understand that it's yours, and I'm grateful to be invited in. And those who didn't? I stopped inviting them, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I stopped explaining, stopped apologizing. If someone asked why I wasn't as available anymore, I told them the truth. Gently, but firmly, I told them I needed to protect my peace, that I was learning to honor myself by honoring my space. Some understood, others didn't. But what stayed with me most was how my life shifted. The more I honored my boundaries, the more I attracted people who honored them too. My home became lighter, my body more relaxed, my thoughts less cluttered. It was as if my environment finally reflected the healing I had long been chasing. So now, when someone treats my home like a public bench, I don't just get annoyed, I get curious. Why do they feel entitled to me? And more importantly, why did I ever believe I had to say yes to that? We teach people how to treat us, not just with our words, but with our thresholds, with what we allow. And when we raise the bar, when we say this space is sacred, we begin to transform not just our homes, but ourselves. Because at the end of the day, the real question isn't, who's walking into your house? It's who are you letting walk into your peace? There's a certain kind of visitor who comes through your door, not to connect, not to enjoy your company, but to quietly take. They don't always ask. They don't always announce their intentions. But every time they leave, something feels missing. And it's not just the snacks from your kitchen or the bottle of wine you were saving. It's something subtler, your energy, your warmth, your sense of safety. It's funny, growing up, we were taught that being a good host meant being generous. You give without keeping count. You offer without expecting. But what no one tells you is that generosity without boundaries quickly turns into depletion. And the people who exploit that most skillfully often come disguised as family or old friends. I remember this distant cousin of mine, the kind of person you only hear from when they need something. He showed up one evening, completely unannounced, said he was just passing through. I welcomed him in, offered food, a drink, a place to rest. Within an hour, he was asking about a jacket hanging by the door. That yours? Looks brand new. Then he noticed a drill in the corner. You even use that thing? Before I could answer, he was joking about borrowing it. By the time he left the next day, he had my jacket, the drill, and $300 in his pocket I'd never see again. At first, I felt annoyed, but more than that, I felt ashamed. How could I be so naive, so easy to manipulate? But when I sat with that feeling, I realized it wasn't about the stuff. It was about the pattern. This wasn't the first time. It had happened before, in smaller ways, in quieter moments. A friend borrowing books and never returning them, a relative who always came empty-handed, but left with groceries or a few bucks until payday, and I had let it happen, again and again. Why? Because I didn't want to seem petty, because I wanted to be liked, because I thought saying no made me selfish. That's the trap. The emotional blackmail of obligation, especially when it comes wrapped in phrases like, "We're family," or "Come on, it's not a big deal." But here's the thing. Your home is not a charity. Your fridge is not public property. Your wallet is not a community resource. And love, real love, never requires you to betray yourself. Jung wrote that every act of pleasing others at the expense of the self feeds the shadow. That every time we silence our discomfort to avoid confrontation, we bury a little more of who we are. And eventually, that buried self becomes resentful, bitter, passive-aggressive, or numb. I saw that version of myself once in the mirror, someone who smiled while handing over what he didn't want to give, someone who nodded while feeling used, someone who couldn't even enjoy his own home anymore because he had filled it with the footprints of people who didn't respect it. That's when I started practicing a new kind of hospitality, one rooted not in guilt, but in mutual respect. If someone came over and offered nothing, I paid attention, not because I needed gifts or money or gestures, but because presence without participation is a warning sign. If they took without asking, I noticed. If they assumed instead of appreciated, I took a step back. And slowly, I began to teach myself how to say no. Not rudely, not with shame, just no. I'm using that. I'm not lending money right now. Please don't take that. Simple sentences, hard to say at first, but each time I said one, I felt lighter, more in control, more like myself. It's not about becoming rigid or paranoid. It's about becoming clear, about drawing a line between generosity and self-abandonment. Because when you say yes to everyone else, you often say no to yourself. And that imbalance will always come back to you, in exhaustion, in resentment, in silence that feels heavier than any word. One day that same cousin called me again, needed a small favor. I told him gently but firmly, "I can't help this time." He paused, sounded surprised, maybe even hurt, but I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I just let the silence carry the weight of the truth, that my peace had become more important than avoiding discomfort. And you know what? He never called again. But I didn't miss him, because some people aren't meant to stay in your life, especially if they only show up with open hands and closed hearts. Protecting your home isn't just about locked doors. It's about clear boundaries, about knowing that you can love someone from a distance if closeness costs you your joy. It's about trusting that your worth isn't measured by how much you give away, but by how well you care for what's already yours. So if you've ever felt used, if you've ever looked around your space and wondered why you feel so tired, ask yourself, who have I let in that I should have kept outside? And maybe next time when the knock comes at the door, you'll pause, you'll listen, and you'll remember. Not everyone who knocks deserves to be let in. There's a kind of presence that drains you without ever raising its voice, without making a mess, without saying a single unkind word. You might not even notice it at first. These people don't shout or demand or take your things. They just sit there, quiet, still, barely engaging. But when they leave, it feels like a vacuum has passed through the room, like some invisible thread inside you has snapped. I didn't understand it for a long time, how someone so gentle, so unobtrusive, could leave such a heavy silence behind. I used to tell myself it was just me. Maybe I was too sensitive, too introverted, too easily exhausted. But time and again, after spending time with certain people, I'd feel hollow, not sad, not angry, just flat, depleted in a way I couldn't quite explain. There was this woman I used to know, a friend of a friend. We'd hang out occasionally, nothing too deep. She'd come over, sit on the couch, sip tea, and that was it. I'd do most of the talking. I'd ask about her life, her feelings, her dreams. Her answers were always minimal, shrugs, one-word replies. And when I shared something personal or vulnerable, I'd get a blank stare in return. Not cruelty, not disinterest, just a wall. She never criticized me, never asked for favors, never imposed. But every time she left, the room felt colder. I'd walk around the apartment afterward, trying to shake off this strange fog. I couldn't explain why, but it was as if something sacred had been disturbed, not violated, just dulled, dimmed, like someone had turned down the light inside me. Jung described this as passive vampirism, when someone doesn't give anything of themselves emotionally, but absorbs your presence like oxygen. They don't mean harm. Often they don't even know they're doing it, but their emotional absence becomes your burden, because you end up carrying the weight of the entire interaction, trying to fill the space, to bridge the gap, to keep something alive that was never really mutual. I started paying attention, noticing who left me feeling full and who left me empty, and it was shocking how often it wasn't the loud or chaotic people that drained me. It was the quiet ones, the ones who never asked questions, who never laughed with me, cried with me, reflected with me. They were just there, like furniture, and somehow their silence demanded more from me than any argument ever could. I remember one night in particular. She had stayed for hours, barely speaking. I kept the conversation going, out of habit, out of politeness, out of a desperate need to avoid the crushing silence. When she left, I sank onto the floor and cried. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because I felt so unseen, so invisible in my own home. That was the moment I realized. Presence isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's a withdrawal disguised as connection. So I made a quiet vow to myself. From that point on, I would measure the value of a guest not by how little trouble they caused, but by how the space felt after they left. Did I feel lighter? Warmer? More myself? Or did I feel like I had just performed in a one-person play for an audience that never clapped? It wasn't about demanding fireworks from every interaction. I love quiet moments. I cherish calm. But there's a difference between peaceful silence and emotional vacancy, between stillness and apathy. And once I could feel that difference, really feel it, I stopped inviting her over. She never asked why, never reached out, just faded. And honestly, that told me everything I needed to know. These days, I'm more protective than ever of who gets to share my space. If someone doesn't ask a single question all evening, I notice. If I feel like I have to keep the energy afloat all by myself, I pay attention. If I feel emptier after connection than I did before, I step back. Because our energy, our attention, our warmth, our presence is not an infinite resource. It's sacred. And just like we wouldn't let someone repeatedly borrow money and never pay it back, we shouldn't let people borrow our presence without offering theirs in return. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your soul is to stop performing, to stop entertaining emotional silence, to stop being the life raft for someone who doesn't even notice you're floating beside them. If a person never meets you halfway, emotionally, energetically, spiritually, it's okay to stop meeting them at all. You deserve connection that gives back, conversations that nourish, presence that feels like presence, not absence wearing a polite mask. And if someone disappears from your life when you stop doing all the work to keep them there, let them go. That silence, as hard as it might be, is still better than the one you carried alone. It took me years to understand that saying no wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of love, not just for myself, but for others too. Because when you say yes out of guilt, out of fear, out of habit, you're not giving, you're abandoning. You're handing over pieces of yourself that weren't offered freely, and each time you grow a little smaller inside. I used to think that being a good person meant being available, that I had to say yes to dinner invitations, last-minute drop-ins, emotional unloading, lending money, giving rides, offering a couch, listening without end, especially if it came from family. But we're blood, but they need you. But you'll regret it if you don't. No one warned me that blood can bind and suffocate in the same breath, that being needed isn't the same as being respected, that love, real love, respects boundaries, and that guilt is not the compass you should use to navigate your life. I remember the first time I said no to a relative, not with an excuse, not with a softened version, just no. They wanted to stay at my place for the weekend. I was exhausted. I had plans to rest, to be alone, to reconnect with myself. But for the first time, instead of folding under obligation, I simply said, I'm not hosting anyone this weekend. Silence followed. That heavy pause, that invisible weight of judgment. But I didn't explain. I didn't follow it up with apologies or justifications. And you know what happened? Nothing. The world didn't end. They found somewhere else to stay, and I had one of the most peaceful weekends of my life. It was liberating and terrifying, because once you realize how much of your life has been shaped by trying not to disappoint others, you start to question everything. How many friendships you maintained because it was easier than letting go. How many conversations you endured just to avoid conflict. How many moments of rest you sacrificed because someone else really needed you. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But how can you do that if your life is built on everyone else's expectations? I started to notice something. The more I honored my own boundaries, the more people around me revealed themselves. Some respected it, quietly nodded, maybe even thanked me for being honest. Others pushed back. Hard, guilt-tripped, questioned, accused. You've changed, they'd say, as if that were a bad thing. But of course I had changed. I was finally taking responsibility for my energy. I was finally protecting the parts of me that used to get walked over in the name of being nice. Here's what they don't tell you. The people who truly love you will love your no just as much as your yes. They won't punish you for needing space. They won't manipulate you into compliance. They'll trust your self-awareness. And those who can't, maybe they were never really there for you. Maybe they were there for what you could give. There's a line I carry with me now. My peace matters more than their expectations. I say it to myself when I feel that familiar tightness in my chest, that urge to say yes when I mean no. It reminds me that I am not responsible for managing other people's emotions at the expense of my own. And you know what's beautiful? When you start living this way, when you start choosing yourself, kindly but firmly, you attract a different kind of person. People who don't flinch when you set a boundary. People who say, of course, take your time, or I get it, or thanks for being honest. People who want you whole, not hollowed out. So if you're struggling with that guilt, that voice that says, but they'll be hurt, or but I owe them, ask yourself this: what do I owe myself? Because if your house, your heart, your energy, your time, if they're always open to everyone, then where do you go to rest? Learning to say no without shame has been one of the most healing things I've ever done. It's not about building walls. It's about building a life where your yes actually means something, because it's real, because it's not driven by fear or pressure, but by truth. So here's my truth. I love my peace. I love my space. I love the version of myself that feels free, not cornered. And every time I honor that, I come home to myself more deeply, more fully. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can say to others, to the world, to your past, is simply, no, not today, not anymore.